The average healthy human has 30 to 50 milligrams of total aluminum in their body. We think that's probably conservative. It's probably higher, and it's definitely higher if someone has a neurodegenerative condition. And you go, all right, well, where is it, right? So as I mentioned before, 50% of it's in the bone, 25% of it they say is in the lung, and the other 25 would be distributed across soft tissue, including the brain. And so then you go, all right, well, how does it get in there? You're either going to inhale it, essentially, or you're going to get it through ingestion or transdermally.
In my opinion, it's like you have this overabundance of aluminum that everybody's being exposed to, right? So we're all getting exposed to it, even if we're like eating a pretty clean diet and working in pretty good cookware and not using antiperspirant and not drinking tap water. Even if we're doing that, we're still getting a dose from the geoengineering.
I think it's awesome incorporating a safer, gentler approach, because then a lot of people go to certain providers like, oh, you have all these heavy metals, let's do these really intense chelation therapies. And if someone's already depleted, which they are, in some of those key minerals, that can be very dangerous, And so I think it's really helpful for people listening to know as well that there are ways to get these things out, at least lower your exposure and, increase your excretion of them in a very safe, gentle way, just using what your body needs. All right. Well, Jeff and Jonathan, welcome to the Unfiltered Healing Podcast.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And, it's my first time meeting you, Jonathan. So it's a pleasure to meet you. And Jeff has been extremely helpful in supporting me in my practice using a device called the OligoScan, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And, maybe that's a really good segue to start with. If Jeff, you want to tell the listeners maybe a little brief about who you are, and then we'll turn it over to Jonathan as well before we kind of jump into the deep end today.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Jeff Lioons. I'm the creative director of OligoScan. My father's been the global distributor of OligoScan for about 15 years. Prior to that, he started Douglas Labs, which was a pretty big supplement company. So I've been fortunate to have been raised in an alternative health, holistic health community pretty much my whole life, been exposed to it at a very early age. And specifically with the OligoScan, my dad brought it home about 9 years, well, maybe longer than that. Probably he brought it home back when I was in college, and I scanned myself and I didn't really think anything of it. And my report showed really bad, and I was in college, so I was doing all the wrong things and didn't really think anything of it. And I scanned myself a year later, still kept seeing really, really deficient status across all the minerals and vitamins. And I kept doing that for a couple of years. And then finally it kind of just hit me maybe this thing is actually showing me what I need to take into consideration. And that really launched me down my own personal health journey. And fast forward to today, I've scanned about 6,500 people with the OligoScan in the past 9 years. It's an incredible technology. What it's doing is we're shining the full visible light spectrum into the peripheral tissue of the hand. So every metal and minerals and element, every element has a different color, and that color is determined by its atomic emission spectra. So we're shining the full visible light spectrum into the hand tissue, and we're measuring the momentum change of light to give us an idea if a mineral's deficient or if a metal's in excess. So if we look at, the different types of testing, right? There's blood tests. A blood test, you take a draw from the body. It's really looking at the past 48 hours of what's in circulation based on food, water, air, possibly amalgam fillings. But the blood is really looking at what's in circulation. It's a transportation system of nutrients. It's not showing you what's accumulated. The body wants to keep the blood pretty stable. So blood tests are great for certain, measurements like C-reactive protein and homocysteine and other markers. Blood tests are great. But for the accumulation of metals in the body, I think it's really not telling us the whole story. You have HTMA tests, which are looking at what the body's excreting via the hair in the past 90 days. Again, it's a solid test. They actually use, when they take the hair sample, they actually burn the hair sample and look at the light signature. So it's similar to spectrophotometry that we're using. It's just we're applying it to the tissue. So HTMA is looking at excretion. Okay, urine test, provoked or unprovoked. Do you use a chelating agent to provoke the body to release the metal? Urine is looking at, again, excretion. So OligoScan is looking at accumulation. It's what's accumulated or what's bioavailable in the tissue. So all the different tests have their pros and cons. I would say the con with OligoScan is that, we're not measuring the aluminum in the brain. We're not measuring the cadmium in the kidneys. We're not measuring the mercury in the heart. The only way to know those exact levels is going to be to take a biopsy of tissue. Well, nobody really wants to give brain tissue to get sampled. So it's, the OligoScan is a proxy. We're looking at the peripheral tissue of the hand, but we're looking at the intracellular levels. So if the aluminum is high in the peripheral tissue, it's high intracellularly, because technically the light's penetrating the blood, the cells, and the interstitial space, which is the beta network. So if we can get an understanding of mineral proficiency or metal toxicity in the intracellular peripheral tissue, we can then assume that the aluminum is likely going to be higher in the brain, or the cadmium is likely going to be higher in the kidneys. But it's really an amazing test to give us an insight about the root cause of our issues and what we need to address, specifically in terms of minerals and metals.
Yeah. And before you jump in, Jonathan, just for a second, I think that's really important, because there's a lot of, rather harder, I guess you could say, diagnoses, for instance, like autism or like Alzheimer's, where there oftentimes it's multifactorial, but there's oftentimes difficulty detoxifying and doing things of that nature. And so some of those other tests, you may not find much of anything because they're holding on to it. So even though the OligoScan doesn't test that, what's in the brain, what's in the organs, it can be a closer edge towards saying, well, if it's in the tissue, then it's probably near those locations as well, which I think is also really valuable.
Yeah. And, it's super quick and it's non-invasive. I mean, you do have to know the blood type for the test. But yeah, I mean, you can get the results in 10 seconds. So to get a snapshot of a glimpse into what somebody is absorbing, digesting, and assimilating into the cell, I always tell people, if I can pinpoint 3 minerals that somebody's low in, or if I can pinpoint 2 metals that are somebody's high in, that at least gives me a starting point of where we need to focus. Minerals are the building blocks. They're the cofactors. It's the reason why we eat food. The body can't produce them. So minerals are the building blocks for antioxidants, vitamins, proteins, enzymes, hormones. So without adequate mineral status, the body can't produce any of those things. So it's really it's the starting point, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's the whole system is going to be affected if the body's mineral deficient. And, we can talk about the reason as to why so many people are deficient. And that's really just a product of our soil and our water.
Yes. Yeah, we'll get into that in a minute. Why don't you share a little bit about yourself, Jonathan?
Sure. I before connecting with Jeff last year, I was a metabolic health coach, helping people mostly with mitochondrial function, ATP output. I have a bioenergetics frame, sort of in the Ray Peat lineage. And I was doing hair testing for people, and it's cumbersome if you've done that before. You get results every 3 to 4 months, because that's how long it takes for the hair to grow back, and you're cutting the hair in the same exact place. So it just leads to less compliance. It takes longer before you can adjust an intervention to help somebody. And the OligoScan pretty much eliminates all that. So you get results right away, as you know, and because you can test more often, you can adjust more quickly to an intervention.
Yeah.
And so, it was as Jeff was talking about, minerals really are kind of a base layer of reality. You need to, if a person's minerally deficient, it's going to affect energy production. And so knowing which ones, because up to this point, it was using hair and basically chronometer to help someone understand what their mineral status would be. So if you don't have access to an OligoScan, chronometer is probably your best way to go about this, is just inputting your food for a couple of days to see where you may be missing some minerals and vitamins for that matter. But what I ended up seeing after I got an OligoScan was there's definitely a mismatch. Even if someone is eating all the right foods, that does not mean that they are minerally replete. And a lot of that has to do with metal antagonism. And so that's an insight the OligoScan also offers is those antagonisms, especially when you look at a very large data set like what Jeff has. So I don't know anybody, and I'm pretty well connected to the mineral balancing community. I don't know anybody in the mineral balancing community that's done 6,500 hair tests.
Yeah.
And so like that is a viewpoint that no one else has. And when you look at enough OligoScan tests like Jeff has, you see patterns emerge between high metals and specific mineral clusters. And so that's a big deal. And also I have found that practitioners don't understand those kinds of interactions either. They see these two separate sections of the report. They see the mineral section and the metal section, and it's almost as because the report is presenting the information that way, they are disparate, disconnected, but it's one ionome. It's one interconnected mineral system, and they're all relating to one another. And so, a good example of that is just if someone is not getting enough calcium in their diet because, say, they're restricting milk because they have some kind of dairy intolerance, then the transporters in the gut for calcium will start to upregulate because you need that. And so if there is no calcium present in the food that you just ate, it will take up something like lead or cadmium in the same transporter. And so at the absorption level, there's competition. At the enzyme level, once those metals or minerals cross through the gut barrier into the body, there's competition with transporters, and there's also competition at the enzyme level. So this is called ionic mimicry, and it requires a deeper layer of understanding in this world of mineral metal antagonism.
Sure. And I think as well, specifically just talking about the hair test as an example, there's a lot of like nuances with it. And so it can be very confusing. Like even in like the huge groups of practitioners that use it, like when I was using it, like so many of the providers themselves are confused. So they're like, I don't slow or fast or this or that. And so I like that the OligoScan, there's a few nuances as well, like you're explaining. You have to know those things, but I would say also there's less like confusion around what does this actually mean in a body doing the test versus you have to like know exactly how to read these for like years in order to know how to do it. Did you experience that as well when you switched over?
Yeah, well, part of the issue is that the mineral balancing community and the hair testing community has been cordoned off to the side as its own almost independent health system, and
Mm,
and and so they developed their own language to describe a lot of these things that don't cross over into, say, a
yeah.
functional medicine perspective. So it's like, what do you mean by calcium shell? Okay, so like part of my work was to get rid of this, the colloquialisms within HTMA reading and make it so I could, because I read a lot of blood, and so it's like, well, a lot of those people are not reading blood, and it's like,
Mm,
well, it's all the same system. We're looking at human physiology here, so
yeah.
there needs to be a translation between one language and the other language. So yeah, I think that it's confusing, not intentionally so. I think it's just because of the way it's evolved over time. But interestingly, when, like, say, Paul Eck and Lawrence Wilson, when they were talking about a lot of the things they were seeing in hair and mineral balancing, much of the, they did incorporate Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome into that model. And that's what they looked at. That's generally what they're referring to when they're referring to like oxidation rate. Someone's a fast oxidizer, a slow oxidizer. And they did overlay mineral use on that GAS spectrum. And so for anybody who doesn't know what this is, you can just do a search for Hans Selye, who's the guy who coined the term stress. And you can look up his general adaptation syndrome, which is basically a chart that demonstrates the levels of stress an organism would be under. And so what those guys did, so that was a common link for me, was I was already schooled in this philosophy. And so there was an easier way for me to grasp what they were talking about. The other thing that has been interesting about OligoScan, and I think more helpful as a baseline tool, as Jeff mentioned, you can't really get a true baseline because you'd have to biopsy a lot of the tissues. And why is that relevant? It's relevant because, as Jeff mentioned, if you measure blood, these metals and minerals are moving around, and a metal is so toxic that the body's going to triage it. So if it cannot eliminate it within that time frame of 24 to 48 hours, it's going to store it. And those storage sites are often places that would require a biopsy to see what the levels would be at. So as an example, 50% of the aluminum in our bodies gets stored in bone. And so, no one's measuring that. Hair's not measuring that, stool or urine, and there's no direct measure of that. And so there are metals that will gravitate towards bone, and there are metals that will gravitate towards soft tissue. And in the case of aluminum, which I think we'll probably end up getting into a little bit later, in the case of aluminum, the reason for that is because it forms tight bonds with phosphate. And calcium and phosphorus are what make up hydroxyapatite, which makes bone mineral. It's what mineralizes the bone. And aluminum has a high affinity for phosphate. And so the other interesting thing is that because it has this high affinity for phosphate, it has a very high affinity for the phosphate that's in ATP. And so it will bind to ATP 1,000 times stronger than magnesium will. And we require magnesium activation of ATP. And so this is where the rubber hit the road for me with using an OligoScan and seeing someone's aluminum status, seeing their magnesium status, and the direct impact that it has on energy.
Yeah, and maybe Jeff, you can answer this as well, since you've done like thousands of scans. Was aluminum like really on your radar before you started scanning? Like, obviously we hear about the harshness of heavy metals, but was it just like after a period of time super eye-opening to you to be like, wow, like every person has high aluminum?
Yeah. To answer your question, yes. I've seen it I've seen it get higher in people's scans consecutively, probably, I don't know, past 5 years. It's always been one of the highest metals in people. I think lately it's been a lot higher. What's also really interesting is I've seen people's silver also get higher on the scan. And, I've looked into it, and they use silver iodide in some of the cloud seeding operations. So that's my hunch. Personally, I was taking colloidal silver almost every day when I was in New York City. And I noticed that my silver got noticeably higher. So I backed off of it because I thought that's what it was. And I asked my buddy Seth at Argene 23, and he told me that a lot of the silvers out there, they're a high ppm, and that you really want the ppm lower so it doesn't cause storage in the body. I also don't think you need to be taking silver daily. I think it's definitely something that's advantageous if you're sick or under the weather, but I don't think it's a great idea to take a metal daily. But I do see the use of it medicinally for certain reasons and purposes. I would say also too, I think probably people that have done more tests than me include John Gamble, and he's one of my mentors. I've learned a lot from him in his book, Mastering Chronic Disease, Toxicity, Deficiency, and Infection. He's head of a clinic in Australia, and he's done thousands of tests, but I've learned a lot from him. And then Rashid Buttar, Dr. Buttar, rest in peace. He used to be the distributor for the OligoScan in the US before He passed away, but if you look up Rashid Buttar testimony to Congress, you can read his testimony. And one of the pieces of that testimony that really stood out to me was when he explains that he gave two groups of kids. One of the groups had autism. One of the groups were normal kids. He gave both HTMA tests. And what he found was that all of the kids that had autism, none of them had any metals coming out in the HTMA. Whereas all the normal kids all had high metals in the HTMA. And it's what it reveals, in my opinion, is that like when you're dumping metals, it's a sign that the lymphatic system is actually working. But the kids that didn't have any metals in the HTMA and they all had autism, they're not excreting. And that's really what it boils down to. It's like, is the body excreting or is the body retaining, accumulating? And what are the different things that affect that? What causes somebody to stop excreting and to start accumulating? And that's really the $1 million question. So yeah, it's and I think that's a little bit complex. I think there's probably more than one reason for that.
Sure.
With people that have had mercury fillings for 30, 40 years, does the body get to a point when the mercury is in the mouth and it's coming into the body 24/7? Does the body get to a point where it's like, hey, we got all this mercury coming in. It's been coming in for like 10 years. We can't keep up. We can't keep up with excreting it at the same rate that it's coming in. So we're going to have to put it somewhere. It can't just evaporate. So we're going to put it to the tissue. So is that switch the overburden of metal? Is it the deficiency of minerals coming in through the diet? Is it genetic? I think that there could be multiple different answers for that.
Absolutely. As with everyone, we're all really bio individuals, and there's multifactorial things often. But and it also doesn't, because every person that I've tested so far has high aluminum as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely stressing out their system, because you look at the global effect in the whole person. But I think it is alarming. And as with any of those other metals, you're looking at what's like chronically low level depleting someone all of the time. And that's the point of why we're discussing it, because people just don't know, and maybe they've done some of those tests and they're like, yeah, I'm great, nothing's coming out, but they're still really like symptomatic and other things. And this is why it is important to really educate yourself on how the body works, how it works for you, and how, some things may be helpful and may not be helpful. So what if we just stick on aluminum for a second and we can dig into the other ones? What specifically, so Jonathan, you mentioned a little bit of what aluminum can do. Like, what are some other things that aluminum itself can affect in someone's body?
Yeah. So I think a high level view, and then we can kind of drill down a little bit. One is that there's an agency under the FDA called ATDSR. They're the sort of U.S. toxicology agency. And they estimate that the average healthy human has 30 to 50 milligrams of total aluminum in their body. We think that's probably conservative. It's probably higher, and it's definitely higher if someone has a neurodegenerative condition. And so then you go, all right, well, where is it, right? So as I mentioned before, 50% of it's in the bone. 25% of it, they say, is in the lung. And the other 25 would be distributed across soft tissue, including the brain. And so then you go, all right, well, how does it get in there? Right? You're either going to inhale it essentially, or you're going to get it through ingestion or transdermally. If you're using, for example, like an aluminum antiperspirant. And the mechanics of how it moves around the body through those different routes does vary, except what does look like happens is if you inhale it, eventually the lungs sort of aspirate it and you end up swallowing it. So it does go through eventually ingestion. The majority of that's not going to be absorbed, but some of the factors that determine its absorption would be it's very antagonistic to silica. And so if there is a lack of silica in a person's diet, which almost everyone is lacking in silica or in its elemental form silicone, then it has it's very easy for it to be absorbed. Once it is absorbed, it's essentially moving around. Immediately, it binds to transferrin, which is the iron transport protein. And so it's sort of moving around via transferrin, and then it will bind to phosphate, as I mentioned, in the bone. It will bind to ATP wherever the ATP is, and it will cross the blood-brain barrier on the transferrin receptor. So that's how it gets into the brain. I know I'm not directly answering your question yet, but what I'm trying to do is lay out like how it moves around and where it goes, and that would determine then the pathologies it would create. And so bone is a great storage place. It is the least redox active place. It is the most stable place for it to be put, which is why the body puts it there. There's, it does seem like there is a real intelligent design here. And the most sensitive tissue that it would go into would be the brain. And so it is, there, if you look through all the literature on neurodegeneration, which I would say is probably the most prominent, pathology that it would create. We're talking Alzheimer's, MS, Parkinson's, and ASD. That so it gets in there predominantly through transferrin, but also on citrate. It will bind to citrate and cross the blood-brain barrier. Citrate is used in the citric acid cycle in energy production. And so once it does get in there, it creates a bunch of problems now. And one of the problems it creates is that because this transferrin is heavily laden with aluminum, it cannot pick up iron that would be, it would be reduced iron. It cannot pick up that reduced iron. And so the iron pool in the brain starts to increase. And so free or labile iron creates what are known as Fenton reactions, which are like highly, highly inflammatory. And it reacts with basically the lipids in the neurons. And so you get this oxidative effect with the lipids because of this free iron. You've got the additional but less so redox problem that aluminum creates. And then you've got additional problems with like free copper that starts to accumulate there as well. That's a little bit more complex, not as direct why that occurs. And so those are the primary sort of pathologies you see. Secondarily, though, this binding that happens at the level of the bone is pretty frequent in creating, parathyroid activation. And so, as I mentioned before, if you're not getting enough calcium in your diet, which is important for regulating or keeping parathyroid hormone low, what will happen is your body is basically sensing via the parathyroid how much calcium is in the blood. If there's not enough, then and you're not eating enough, then it's going to basically increase parathyroid hormone, which will then tell your storage vitamin D to convert to active vitamin D. And that active vitamin D then tells the bones, release minerals, release the calcium, release the phosphorus. And it will, by the way, also release any stored metals that are in there also. And so that's how the body is regulating calcium. And it really is all dependent upon your dietary intake. So with people that have high aluminum, there is a movement towards osteopenia and can eventually lead towards osteoporosis. So that's another pathology we can see. And a third place, which I think is under-recognized, it's less studied, and this is more my hypothesis, is that the major storage area for silicon in the body is in the collagen tissues. So the fascia, in the ligaments, the tendons, the joint capsules. That's where silicon is located, and it's located there because the body needs it to make collagen. And because it's a natural binding agent with aluminum, the depletion of silicon in these collagen tissues will lead to more brittle tissues, more likelihood of tears, more likelihood of the integrity of collagen in these high, like dense collagen tissue I was talking about. They tend to, you get stiffer and they tear much more easily. So those are the three places that you would predominantly see a problem.
I think glyphosate does that as well, correct? As far as affect the collagen through the glycine amino acid. So it's kind of like and that's everywhere as well. So it's kind
Exactly.
of like no wonder, you hear collagen everywhere promoting everything. But the true root is not that you need a ton more supplements. It's that there's things depleting the integrity of your collagen and the silica and the glycine and things like that as well.
And on top of that, one of the roles of silica is to get calcium to the right places, prevents calcification. And you look at how many people are getting adequate amounts of silica from their diet on a daily basis, and how many people are getting an abundance of aluminum, which is the antagonist for silica, and it creates this like perfect storm.
And is it that people just aren't like ingesting enough silica in their diet, or is it because our food sources are so void of nutrients from the soil, or is it obviously probably a combination?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. In my opinion, it's like you have this overabundance of aluminum that everybody's being exposed to, right? So we're all getting exposed to it, even if we're like eating a pretty clean diet and cooking in pretty good cookware and not using antiperspirant and not drinking tap water. Even if we're doing that, we're still getting a dose from the geoengineering, which is, I know it's controversial, but it's just fact at this point.
Yeah.
And it's getting into the soil. It's lowering the pH of the soil, the plants. When the pH of the soil is low, it's basically disturbing the microbiome. The plants aren't absorbing as many minerals from the soil because also of the use of phosphate fertilizer. Also, the water by and large in America is pretty polluted, and tap water is just an abomination. So we're not getting silica. Now, there's different parts of the world that have higher silica waters than others. Not every spring, not every artesian well is going to have high silica. So I think the overabundance of the aluminum in the environment creates the necessity to increase the silica, the synergist. You have to balance those two. But most people aren't getting enough silica from their food. I mean, the top sources from food are going to be green beans. It's going to be obviously water, depending on the water. It's going to be beer, but Jonathan's against that because of the hops.
Yeah, we could get on that. Yeah,
you're on a lone island for that one, Jeff.
No, he actually educated me on that. I think it's really relevant. Do you want to talk about it, Jonathan?
Yeah, sure. So the silica is in the hops, okay, which is why, so we have a study on our site at INM Labs that details the amount of silica in different foods and the absorption of the different forms of silica, which is really important because you can't just like go grind up quartz crystal, or sand that's on the beach, which is predominantly silicon, and then mix it with water and swallow it. You won't absorb it. So we're talking about different forms of silica, and so hops is very high, and then Jeff said green beans, and horsetail is very high, and bamboo is high. They're not all high in terms of absorption, but they have high silicon content in those foods. So so years ago, this is like to answer Jeff's thing he wants me to talk about. So
it's
years
relevant.
ago, I interviewed an herbalist. His name is Stephen Buhner. He got kind of famous because he wrote a whole bunch of books on curing Lyme disease with different herbs. And he had a protocol that he was using. He's got a bunch of books out. He's not with us anymore. But he was he was really a master herbalist and intuitive. And he wrote on a lot of other topics. One of them was beers, the pre-Roman beers of, ancient Europe. And he explained to me, and it's in his book, I don't know exactly the title of the book, you can find it on Amazon, is that it wasn't until the Romans codified the requirement of hops being in the beer that hops was used regularly. And so the beers were different fermentations of many other herbs. And so then they created the codex, the Bavarian code for what you could make it with. Well, it turns out, hops is not only high in silica, it's very high in phytoestrogens. And so it was quite common for the brewers to develop what was called brewer's droop, where they would develop breasts as a result of estrogen dominance. And so they would be handling the hops, and this was like apparent. It was very apparent. And so then you go, okay, well, so the higher, it's like ironic if you think about it, because like the manliest beers are the IPAs, the ones that have the highest hop content, and they are actually the most estrogenic of all the beers. So anyway, that's my short piece on hops.
Fun fact. That's actually very interesting. Because I have heard like people use, hops in a form of silica, and like, companies are trying to create that. Now, you guys, before we go into the sources of aluminum, you guys came together and created your own product based on, what you were seeing was also being depleted from aluminum. What did you specifically use as your source of silica? Because silica is in there for your product.
You want to take that, Jeff, or you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll chime in.
Yeah. So we tested this for 5 or 6 months last year, and we had 2 different test groups. We ran a study over the summer for 2 months, and then we ran a second one in the fall of last year, and we tried different forms of silica. And so where we ended up landing is the most absorbable form of silica, which actually matches the absorption of the silica in hops, is a form called MMST. And so that's what we use. That's our primary binder of aluminum. And secondarily, we use malic acid. And so we are using malic acid in the magnesium malate form. So basically it's magnesium bound to malic acid. And that also acts. There's literature on that. So basically, how it all kind of came together was Jeff and I started kicking the idea around. He educated me on the ubiquity of aluminum and some of the minerals that it was antagonizing. Once I got an OligoScan and started scanning people, I was seeing the same pattern show up that he explained. And the two, the primary pattern you'll see for someone that's in, say, the high minus or the high plus category in the OligoScan is a magnesium and a silicon deficiency. And it's very apparent with silicon. I mean, it's like, one's high, one's low. And you never have high silicon and high aluminum at the same time. And by the way, nobody is in the normal range of aluminum either. So that's really apparent. But what also started to show up was people that were very high in the excess category of aluminum. They had lithium deficiency. And so we basically stacked the MMST with the magnesium malate. So we would get both magnesium and malic acid. We added lithium orotate to the formula. And then, and I'll let Jeff take this, but we also added boron in the form of boron glycinate to the formula. We added a little bit of P5P, the active B6, to assist in the magnesium uptake. So that's basically the formula that was built off of all of these, not just looking at the OligoScan data, but also looking through the literature to see what was supported. And it does turn out that they both match up. So that's basically how we formed it.
Yeah, and it all really started. I was in Sedona, visiting a couple clinics, and I noticed that Jonathan reached out like in the years past, and I reached out to him. I just wanted to get together and get a coffee and scan him. And at the same time, I was reading this book, The Synergy Between Minerals and Important Physiological Processes. And this book was definitely one of the, there you go. I mean, it's incredible.
That's really good.
I think it's my favorite book that I've read besides Gamble's. I just really like how simple it is. I like how it talks about all the different minerals. I like how it talks about aluminum being the most prevalent heavy metal that affects all the minerals. But so the missing piece was that book and reading it. And then I met Jonathan, and we just kind of came together and we're like, all right, let's tackle this beast. let's try to use mineral balancing to address the root cause of the aluminum toxicity. But also, boron is another essential mineral that gets depleted from aluminum. And, if you look at the periodic table, when you look at aluminum, you look right next to it, you see silica, you see right above it, boron, you see right to the left of it, magnesium, and then you see sodium, potassium, lithium, all kind of in the same area. And one of my other mentors, Michael Fesler with Herbalix Restoratives, he's been studying aluminum for, I don't know, probably 15 plus years. He's been using OligoScan to demonstrate the toxicity. I've learned a lot from him, and he always told me that the first 6 minerals on that chart are going to be impacted by aluminum. One of the ways Michael, uses, or I would say remedies aluminum toxicity is more transdermally. But he would always tell me that, when you see high aluminum, one of the questions you always ask is, do you have dry and calloused feet, like cracked feet? Because that's a sign that the lymphatic system is blocked. Obviously asking, does the person use antiperspirant deodorant, right? Like, what is antiperspirant deodorant? It's aluminum that's basically blocking the lymphatic system, and the aluminum the metal has nowhere to go.
Mm-hmm.
So antiperspirant means anti-excretion, anti-sweat.
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, yeah. So boron and silica obviously were 2 of the minerals that are like the heaviest hitters, as well as the lithium. And the malic acid was one that Jonathan introduced me to. But, boron is really an incredible mineral.
Yeah.
I think I sent you the Borax Conspiracy for you to read.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty fascinating. It can increase the vitamin D absorption by 49% in 2 weeks. It's incredible. It's illegal for us to put borax in a capsule and sell it, or boric acid. So we use boron biglycinate, attached to the amino acid glycine. But I'm a big fan of borax as well. So I think that from a mineral balancing approach, the goal is to provide the minerals that aluminum is going to be antagonizing. And I've been really super focused on mineral balancing. I mean, there's tons of different ways to address the same issue, but if the minerals are deficient, in my opinion, it's like the starting point. Like that's the safest starting point that we should all be basically considering.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And I think it's awesome incorporating a like safer, gentler approach, because then a lot of people go to certain providers like, oh, you have all these heavy metals, let's do these really intense like chelation therapies. And if someone's already depleted, which they are, in some of those key minerals, that can be very dangerous, And so I think it's really helpful for people listening to know as well that there are ways to get these things out, at least lower your exposure and, increase your excretion of them in a very safe, gentle way, just using what your body needs because it's already doing it. We're just assisting in the help of that. And so it's great. It's called Aluminum Export, right? That's the name of the one that you created.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great product. And I personally, before I even used your guys's, I was just using, once I scanned myself and I saw aluminum was high, like everybody, I just started using boron and I think a different form of silica, just those 2. And it went down like that much in like 2 months. So boron's really helpful for so many different things. And you don't have to do something really harsh, which I think is awesome. Now, Jeff, you've kind of like scanned over some of the sources of aluminum, like the antiperspirants, and you mentioned a couple other things. What are maybe some other ones that people don't know about? Can you highlight some of those ones?
Yeah. And before I go into that, another reason why people aren't getting enough boron is because of the use of phosphate fertilizer.
Yeah.
And I mentioned the Borax Conspiracy, and basically what that goes into is they look at the soils across the world, and the countries that have the highest boron in the soil have the lowest cases of osteoporosis. And the countries with the lowest boron in the soil have the highest osteoporosis. So there's a correlation there.
Yeah.
Boron is also needed for the production of superoxide dismutase and glutathione production. So it's an essential mineral for detoxification. And again, I really believe that, we wouldn't need to be taking aluminum export or boron, for example, if we were eating foods that were grown in super, super rich soil. But the reality is that for the past 50 plus years in the United States, we've been monocropping. We've been growing the same crop in the same soil, dependent on phosphate fertilizer. And you can grow any crop in NPK fertilizer. But from a micronutrient standpoint, um, it's not the same as if that soil has been regenerated with, poop of animals. So it's really a soil and water issue as to why we need to take these supplements to help us get the adequate minerals. But in terms of other sources of aluminum, the big ones are always antiperspirant deodorant, cookware, so pots and pans like Teflon, air fryers, I would say, like any kind of cheap cookware. Let's see, makeup, sunscreen, teas, antacids are a big one. I used to take antacids in college because of my face would get super red. So I would pop like 2 antacids before I drank alcohol, which was like 4 nights a week, like crazy. And I was thinking that I was like, first off, I should have been like, why is my face turning red? Alcohol is a poison. It's an allergic reaction. But the ACs and the Pepto-Bismols and the Zantacs have a ton of aluminum in them. Processed foods in general, anything with like anti-caking agents, like pancake mix and like frozen cheese pizzas. Let's see, Jonathan, did I miss any?
Aluminum cans, right?
Well, they're usually lined with plastic now, so you don't get much exposure that way. I think also, you mentioned it before, the geoengineering is a thing. It's in the air. It's definitely in the air. So like being able to parse exactly where it's coming from is hard to do. But Jeff tested the deep freeze rainwater that came through, the Midwest and the East Coast back in January, and aluminum was the highest metal in that. So we're, whether it's coming from jet fuel or they're directly spraying that to reflect UV light, or they are, it's dust that's just being kicked up, because aluminum is the third most abundant element in the Earth's crust. And it's the most abundant metal that we have. So it will get particleized. It will start, like blowing around the atmosphere around the planet. And so we will inhale that as well. And then, of course, it's an adjuvant in the whole childhood vaccine schedule. Every one of those essentially requires aluminum to create the so-called immune effect, which is basically your body just reacting to this toxic thing you just put into it. So that's how they get it to work. If you can even say that it's working for some benefit long term.
Yeah, and that's penetrating the blood-brain barrier. So it's not having to go through the stomach, because if I were to eat like a frozen cheese pizza or like pancake mix, maybe only 50% of that gets absorbed because it has to go through the stomach.
Sure.
But if I'm injecting it, it's going directly, passing the blood-brain barrier, and it's going directly to the brain. So yeah, it's in a lot of different things. I will say the last one, which was super fascinating, was those Nespresso coffee makers.
Yeah, the Keurig stuff too. Yeah.
I tested a guy, a friend, and he invited me to his house to test him. And I walked through the kitchen, and I was just looking around, and I see this espresso machine, and he's telling me that he struggles with like chronic migraines in the morning. And I see the Nespresso, his aluminum's off the chart, and I'm like, you might want to stop that Nespresso, because it's going, it's putting hot water through this aluminum can. I've heard that they use seed oils to produce like the perfect crema. So I would just kind of avoid that, but also just kind of like think about like your coffee maker. And if it's aluminum, it's probably not a good idea.
Yeah. I mean, people don't really connect the dots with those things, but it is important. And thank you, Jonathan, for mentioning about vaccines, because that's definitely the most direct route. You guys have probably already heard this, but I actually wrote this down because it was super interesting that you, Jeff, like measured the rainwater, but something came out like a couple of weeks ago from Francis Mengels, who is a U.S. FS biologist. And he said since 2006, they've tested the snow on Mount Shasta, and it has 5 times more aluminum, or 61,000 micrograms per liter, than the soil underneath it. And so basically, the snowfall wasn't safe to drink. And he was like, how can white snow have more aluminum than the mud underneath it? So yeah, it was like over 13 times the federal safety limits for drinking water. So I say that to say, the things that you've also mentioned, I have patients come into, they're like, I'm not using deodorant, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing this, but like my aluminum's still crazy high. And, obviously a lot of people in their youth have had vaccinations, unless they're now. And so this is also a big component. It's not just a conspiracy theory. It's been tested and tracked that we're being inundated, not just with aluminum, but a big part of it. And that's also why we're seeing it so high in every single person. So it's important to mention those studies as well.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard for me because I like to be outside so much. And it's like, you can look outside and it's a beautiful, clear day like it is right now, and you can't tell me that there's not airplanes in the sky today. Mm-hmm. But then I'll look out another day and you see this film and these checkerboards and these crisscrosses. And it's like, it's just like we all need to like consciously wake up without going into a fear state, but it's our reality and it's poisoning the planet, and we're seeing the effects of it.
Yeah, never fear, never anything with any of this. It's just like, well, the whys. We have to talk about the whys, because there's a lot of deception and there's a lot of covering up of things, and there's a lot of pollution. So it's important to speak of the whys. And I think I actually sent you something, Jeff, of another doctor who's been working on this as well. And he's been doing, like, probably in the hundreds now, clinical studies of patients measuring, what's coming out in the sweat after the days where there's high chemtrails, or whatever you want to call them, in the sky. And the numbers are like astounding, because obviously sweat is another really important route of excreting metals. And it's like crazy what he's also, because he has a connection with the lab. And so they're like measuring what's coming out on those days of sweat, and it's enormously high. So tests don't lie.
Tests don't lie. Yeah. Yeah. I love that podcast you sent me. And again, it's like it makes the other case for, okay, we know that the aluminum is going to be coming in.
Yeah.
We have to control that to the best of our ability. Mm-hmm. Number 2 is we have to maximize the mineral synergists that aluminum is going to antagonize.
Yeah.
Lithium, magnesium, boron, silica. Mm-hmm. And then number 3, like you said, we have to maximize excretion. And sweating is just one of the absolute best ways. I mean, it in my opinion, it really is the definition of excretion, at least externally. Mm-hmm. So if we can address the internal excretion and the external excretion, that's our best strategy, I think.
Yeah. Other than working out, how often are you guys like sweat? Yeah, because it's sweating too, right? How often are you guys actually like, saunaing or like doing more excretion?
I mean, I'm like 4 times a week. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was the Finnish study that looked at longevity. I think it was 20 minutes and 40 times a week increased longevity by like 50%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jonathan, how often
I think I'm 3 times. I do sauna 3 times a week. Yeah, I just do Finnish standard. So 20 minutes, 174, which is what they were using in that study. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've mentioned before, like someone that's not sweating, they usually already have potentially high aluminum.
Oh, that's like my first question. And by the way, like where I'm at now is every time I scan somebody, I'm basically trying to prove the OligoScan wrong. So what I do is I basically ask them a bunch of questions related to their scan to try to validate that what they're telling me is actually reflected. And after doing so many of these, it validates 9 out of 10 times. The 1% where it doesn't, and it's probably more like 5%, would be it's underrepresenting. And I've seen that the most with autistic children. Like I've scanned the autistic kid. I asked the mom, like, when did the symptoms start? It was after a shot. And I look at the metals and the aluminum's high, but you would expect it to be like off the chart, but it's not. And my hypothesis with that is that, yeah, the aluminum is not in the peripheral tissue, it's in the brain. And a 6-year-old who has autism hasn't been hasn't been living as somebody like 65 years old that's had all this accumulation from aluminum in their environment coming through their, by the food or water. So I think it's just totally different, right? Like if we have to kind of use common sense to identify like, where do we think the toxin came from?
Yeah.
And if it bypassed the stomach and it was directly, going to the blood-brain barrier, it's probably not in the peripheral tissue as high as it's in the brain.
Yeah. And in addition to aluminum, I mean, we've talked a little bit about mercury being amalgam films, other things. What about copper? Because copper is another one that is an essential mineral, obviously, but you often find in a lot of the skins as well. There's a big imbalance between zinc and copper, and there's totally different sides of that. Like a lot of people have copper toxicity. No, a lot of people are copper deficient. And so maybe Jonathan, you can kind of dig into those differences.
Sure. Well, I can share what I know. I don't feel like I fully grasp this this whole argument yet, because I know Morley Robbins, and I trained in the RCP system, so I get his vantage on things. But also within the HTMA groups, copper is the cause of a lot of problems, right? A lot is put on copper. The problem. So let's just zoom out for a second here. Metals and minerals, when they go into the body, in order to be operational, need to be attached to proteins, whether that is a transport protein or an enzyme or embedded inside of a cell in an enzyme. This is how they are used. And when they are not, when that's not the case, especially with iron and copper, these two can create very damaging oxidative effects. Okay. So the conversation needs to become more precise, I think, because no one has, it's not a matter of too much or too little of the mineral. The problem is how bound or unbound these minerals are. Okay, that's the problem. And so maximizing the binding of these things should be what someone should be looking to do. Now, you can adjust the amounts of the minerals by, for example, taking more zinc to lower copper via the enzyme metallothionein, which will bind copper with high affinity. But if that's what you're doing, then you could end up with a copper deficiency if you do that too much. And, a sign of a copper deficiency would be like early graying hair, because copper is a requirement to make melanin. So you would lose the color, it's the pigment is so that's one way that it will show up. The other side of it is that, if you aren't optimizing for the production of ceruloplasmin, which is the primary protein that copper should be bound to, then you will, and you're just taking copper, but you're not optimizing for ceruloplasmin production. You can end up with copper toxicity, too much unbound copper, creating a problem. So it's like, okay, Jeff and I have been going back and forth a lot on this, because he comes at this from a different vantage, which I really appreciate. So we're working this out right now. I have a feeling we're going to have a solution, like an actual thing we can say in 5 or 6 months. But basically, there's also the relationship too between copper accumulation and estrogen dominance, which go hand in hand with one another, and the lack of zinc, which is sort of a proxy. You can use that as a proxy on the OligoScan for progesterone for women or testosterone for men.
Yeah.
These two hormones have feedback systems with these minerals and tend to cause them to accumulate. And then you go, all right, well, so what is now regulating ceruloplasmin production? What's regulating estrogen breakdown? And that's the liver. And so, Jeff has always kind of brought me back, okay, it's the liver. And then you go, okay, well, what could depress the liver? What could cause liver dysfunction? Well, the primary cause in most cases for liver dysfunction is gut-based endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide. This is the thing that causes non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's the LPS from the gram-negative bacterial overgrowth in somebody's gut. So as a, part of the questionnaire that you can ask yourself or you can ask a patient is,
Mm.
how many times a day are you moving your bowels? If you're constipated, you're going to have an overgrowth. You're going to have an overabundance of this gut-based endotoxin. You're going to have a sluggish liver, as it's called, in like naturopathy. You're going to have lowered ceruloplasmin production. You're going to have lowered glucuronidation of estradiol. And so you're going to see accumulation of copper in that situation. But it also connects the thyroid too, because if you have an increase in estrogen or you're not able to clear it, then you will have slower thyroid conversion of T4 to T3. So now you've got you've got more depressive metabolic effects that are occurring. And so I think really the source point and the biggest lever to pull on is improving gut function. So getting your bowels moving 2-3 times a day, sealing the tight junctions, and making sure that you are remediating the microbiome so that you don't have a lot of that bacteria moving up into the small intestine anymore, because you're actually moving your bowels now, and that the architecture of the colon-based bacteria is such that the keystone bacteria are ruling the land. And so, okay, well, how is that? What causes that disruption? Well, you mentioned one before, and that's the glyphosate laden food that we have to eat. And it's even in organic food because it's just everywhere. It's so ubiquitous. You've got that problem that's continually modifying the microbiome. You've got the problem of, a single course of antibiotics will basically knock out akkermansia, which is a requirement to keep the gut lining sealed. It's regulating the mucin layer. So many people they're non-detect in gut tests for akkermansia. There's simple fixes for these things, by the way. And then the bifidobacteria. So if you can get akkermansia and the bifidos right, you can get them repopulated, then they will provide leverage for the other keystones. And when you have all the keystones working properly, they will manage all the bad guys. You get the LPS lower. You'll see the liver now is unburdened from this, external source of LPS. And now it can start to do other things like improve thyroid conversion. So now thyroid increases. It can glucuron. You also have to make sure the beta glucuronidase, the enzyme that some of these bacteria have in the colon, is not just deconjugating what your liver just did, and then you don't reabsorb that estradiol. So it's complex. I mean, the RCP people basically say, and then I'll hand it over to Jeff here. But here's my one gripe with the RCP people is that it's like, okay, beef liver, that's your answer. And don't, make sure that you don't take any citric acid or any type of ascorbates or anything like that. So no artificial, make sure it's food-based vitamin C when you take it. All that's true. Okay, beef liver is a pretty high source of copper. It's also a high source of retinol or preformed vitamin A, which is required. Both of those things are required to make ceruloplasmin. But even if you provide the substrate, when the liver is dysfunctional, you still won't make enough ceruloplasmin to keep the copper bound. Okay. So you have to sort of revitalize the liver by taking some of this pressure off. The liver's a soldier. It wants to fight on your behalf. It will die on your behalf. And so, but you got to take some of these, you got to take some of the goblins off of it. You know what I mean? So you do those things. But here's the one little piece here. Here's my gripe with the RCP, and that is zinc, copper, iron, and cadmium and lead are all in a cluster together. They're all interacting with one another. And in RCP, they do not discuss the lead and the cadmium relationship to these three minerals that we need. And that is that there are inputs of lead. Lead is actually quite high and problematic. And cadmium is as well. I mean, you know, even if you're eating organic food, you're going to get cadmium in the food supply. Can't get rid of that.
Mhm.
Well, how does your body detoxify cadmium? How does your body detoxify lead? It does it with metallothionein, the same enzyme that will bind copper, the same one that's upregulated by taking zinc. Okay.
Mhm.
And you need to have proper ceruloplasmin, copper bound ceruloplasmin to regulate iron. So there is this very complex cluster of minerals that are all interacting with one another. It's a multi-systems approach. So it's not I can't provide like a really specific and direct single answer to that question.
Yeah, you want to add, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jonathan just hit a lot of the main points.
Yeah.
And, you know, just for me personally, like when I see high copper on the OligoScan, and I see the zinc blockade, my question is always like, why?
Yes.
You know, so the first thing I do is I try to investigate, like, why is the copper not high, but imbalanced,
Yes.
right? And, you know, some of the questions I ask are like anxiety, depression. Do they have they taken birth control? Because I really think that's a huge component to it.
Sure.
Jonathan already mentioned pesticides, but, you know, in this book, they, you know, the synergy between minerals and important physiological processes, she mentions that both copper and manganese basically will bind to pesticides if they're present and create these compounds that the body can't break down.
Right.
So you might have this copper pesticide compound in the body, but the body doesn't know how to digest it. It doesn't know how to metabolize it. So that's a case where you might have high copper, but in reality, you're low in copper because the body can't use the copper that it has.
Right.
I also think that the estrogen imbalance is a huge part of it. One thing that I can't figure out is, and me and Jonathan have been kind of focusing on this lately, is when I see like super high aluminum, I'll tend to see the high copper, high zinc, the blockade. So I absolutely think that there is a link between high aluminum and high copper. And that would make sense from the standpoint of when the aluminum is high, it's going to impact 15 plus other minerals, not just directly like the ones that we tackle in aluminum export, but the second, third, fourth level based on ionic. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate Jonathan's kind of like, you know, encouraging me to like go even deeper. Like,
Yeah.
don't just address the liver, but address the liver dysfunction is a downstream effect of the body's gut actually not absorbing the nutrition that it needs, and the microbiome dysfunction and imbalance. So, you know, I think things like TUDCA and ox bile and liver flushing and coffee enemas and greater Kellandine, I think all those things are advantageous because if I see a high copper and high zinc, like I definitely want to attend to the liver. That's my takeaway. It's like, okay, we got to focus on the liver. And I don't think if you're doing from a holistic natural approach, I don't think focusing on the liver to try to increase the efficiency of the liver is a bad thing. I think we could all benefit from a stronger liver. But I think it's also important to consider that maybe that liver dysfunction is downstream effect from actually the gut.
Yes.
So I think it's multi-pronged.
Yes, a lot of things stem from the gut. And even a dysregulated brain nervous system can affect the gut. So it can be multifactorial, right? But yes, Jonathan, that was really excellent of your explanation of that. And I think it is important to know that because it's not always just take zinc, but nothing's changing and in the grand scheme of things. And so that was really helpful and really important. Thank you guys so much for your time. I know that we went over a little bit, so thank you so much for your time. Do you have any final quick words that you want to leave the listeners with? We've given a lot of information, but also a lot of hope. And that is always my goal, is because God always provides answers and antidotes for anything that man does. So any final words that you guys want to say to leave the listeners? Also, please share where they can order your aluminum export. I will put it in the bio for the listeners, as well as the code that you guys gave me for that. But any final words for you guys?
Well, I think that with regard to aluminum, the You know, the basic protocol is reduce your input as much as possible. Take the balancing minerals, hopefully it's our product, and sweat. And if you do those things, aluminum is relatively easy to get out of the body, okay, compared to the other metals. So I
Yeah.
think this is very hopeful. And you can actually see improvements month after month if you were to go in and test. And I've seen that, and Jeff has seen that. And that's what our studies showed last year. We had an average of an 18% decrease in aluminum across the board. And we have 10 case studies up on our website. So our website is ionomelabs.com. It's not easy to spell. So hopefully you got the link in there. It's IONOME labs.com. And yeah, we wish everybody well.
Yeah, I would just, the one thing to add to that too is I would not forget the transdermal excretion, and obviously, you know, sweat covers that, but I also think that detox baths are really powerful. My favorite formula is Epsom salt, a lot of it. You know, half a cup of baking soda, half a cup of borax. You can put in some iodine, some essential oils, and, you know, pretty hot, clean water. You can put a little bit of bentonite clay in there as well. But detox baths are really, really powerful. And for people that have used antiperspirant deodorant for a number of years, and like I said, the bottom of the feet are dry and cracked, you could try something like Herbalix Restorative Salve and see if it works. You know, I think there's a lot of I don't think evidence is the right word, but I think there's a good theory that the feet are one of the major excretion points. And that's why you have things like the Ionic foot bath. And that's why when you see somebody's aluminum super high, the bottom of their feet are dry and cracked, and they might have swelling in the inner knee. And that's a sign that, again, the lymphatic system is blocked. And also, you look at the increase of breast cancer. And I don't know if there's a correlation with that and the use of antiperspirant deodorant, but if you're blocking the lymphatic system from the underarm down, and somebody develops breast cancer, and somebody's got a lot of swelling in the inner knee, and they have dry and cracked feet, you can kind of trace the lymphatic system all the way up, and it's not imbalanced. It's not draining.
Yeah.
So I think those are other things to consider as well. But yeah, from a mineral balancing perspective, we're really excited about the product. The other thing I'll say is, you know, always have faith, do the best you can. Don't let any of this like cause like fear. It's just like, we're trying to be proactive, and we're trying to basically make up for what the food no longer has in it, and water for that matter. But yeah, stay positive and just do the best you can, and find community.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you guys again so much. Thank you all of you listeners for supporting. Please share this to the masses because it will help so many people. We'll catch you guys on the next episode. Take care and God bless.